Good afternoon. Welcome to Nonprofit Quarterly, our webinar, Remaking the Economy, Mutual Aid, 3 City Case Studies. I am Steve Dubb, Senior Editor and Director of the Economic Justice Program here at Nonprofit Quarterly, and coming to you from Boston on land historically stewarded by the Massachusetts Nation. This webinar came together through conversation with members of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network and seeks to lift up how communities are responding on the ground to the health and economic crisis that is COVID-19. Today, our webinar panelists are, and very honored to be here with these colleagues. Danielle Mkali is Director of Cooperatives, Transformation and Healing at Nexus Community Partners in St. Paul, Minnesota. Mike Strode is an avid cyclist, writer, and solidarity economy organizer for the Kola Nut Collaborative in Chicago. And Dr. Yolande Tomlinson is a radical queer Black feminist, mama, community builder, writer, educator, and coordinator of the Metro Atlanta Mutual Aid Fund. A few notes. First, very excited to take your questions. We will start with some slides. I'll ask a few questions to the panelists and then we'll open it up to yours. So please enter your questions in the question box and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Second, we will share the recording and the slides after the webinar. And most likely on Friday. So please don't ask, will I get the slides and the recordings? You will, absolutely. One last thing, this webinar is free to you, but producing this webinar is not free. So if you like what we're doing and can afford to support NPQ's economic justice work and believe in what we're doing, please consider making a donation today. You can also join the conversation via social media. We use the hashtag rebuild the economy. Thanks for joining us. And there will be a survey at the end of this webinar. Please complete that to inform our future work. And with that, let's begin and go to the next slide. And just very briefly, I want to put in a quick notice about that this is a continuing series and we will have a special post-election edition. We're titling it simply Where to Now and Beyond. It'll be Thursday, November 12th from 2 to 3 Eastern time. And in addition to myself, there'll be Gar Alperovitz from the Democracy Collaborative in Washington, D.C., Laura Flanders, who's hosts the Laura Flanders Show from New York, which is now showing on public broadcasting, and Dr. Stacy Sutton, who's an urban planning professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago. So very excited to bring that to you. And with no further ado to kick off today's webinar, Mike, why don't you begin? Next slide.
All right, so I was, I guess, non-democratically elected, as it were, to go ahead and offer just a bit of context around mutual aid. So noted here is something of a well-known quote, slogan from Lila Watson, Aboriginal activist from Queensland in Australia. If you have come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I think, there's a great deal of substance there inside of what that means for mutual aid, a practice and a politic that emphasizes solidarity rather than charity. And when we talk about solidarity, things that are done with and together, charity, things that are done for, but even more deeply, where does power and decision-making reside? Do you have power over the process? Do you have power with people inside of a process? And then also where's decision-making happening? All of that is situated in terms of what it means for something to be mutual aid rather than something to be sort of a more charitable or endeavor. So it's really important for yourselves as practitioners in nonprofit organizations, for the people in community that are engaged in work. If you want that work to be mutual aid, we want to make sure that that power and decision making reside within that community where the work is being done. And then, and I did not give reference to my graphic practitioner of that poster before, but that was Ricardo Levin Morales. This graphic, Monica Trinidad of For the People Artists Collective here in Chicago, we keep each other safe. And so I'm using this to just frame some mutual aid principles. These principles, are these were principles as they were written or spoken inside of one of Highlander's mutual aid sessions at the beginning of the shelter in place in COVID-19 crisis. But these are principles that I think a lot of mutual aid practitioners can see themselves invested in and embodying. Again, solidarity, not charity, as already expressed. Liberation, not recuperation. We do not want, a better, safer, capitalism, a better, safer Amazon warehouse. We actually want people to feel liberated in the process from the things that oppress them, economic oppressions, cultural, social, racial oppressions. We want those things cast off. So mutual aid is really about that liberatory process and getting to that point and not just making people feel better about their circumstances. Autonomy and power building. This is not a process that is necessarily, meant to make people feel that they have power, but really actually to ensure that communities are able to take power from these institutions and these forces that continue to kind of, that are levers of oppression upon those spaces. So, building autonomy within communities, building power within communities, this is sort of the direction that mutual aid is taking. A Zapatista proverb, everything for everyone, nothing for us. So again, this is not meant to be a process wherein, this mutual aid creates a situation where you are able to garner and gather resources unto ourselves or unto yourselves or unto our organizations. But this is meant to say that, how is it that we are, again, spreading resources, spreading power, spreading decision-making out across community. Cooperation, not competition. So where there is an opportunity for us to cooperate among organizations, cooperate among entities, cooperate among pods, all of these things, we seek that opportunity to cooperate and share resources with one another rather than compete for resources in the sort of scarce capitalist framework. And then lead by asking, I think the sort of Zapatista proverb there is lead by obeying, right? But effectively, we are in service of communities that we are some that we are in direct relationship with. And if you're not in direct relationship with, then this quote becomes even more important, that you are asking communities where it is that they're seeking to go, what are the outcomes that they are seeking to engage, and that you are really in deep communication, with them and being led by those that inquiry. And so that concludes my sort of initial introduction or foray into mutual aid for you all.
Great, thanks, Mike. And Yolande, I know you have some notes you want to add and a little bit of historical perspective. Next slide.
Yeah, thanks, Steve and Mike. The next slide, please. So, that was a very clear, cogent definition and some guiding principles about mutual aid. And I want to start us off just looking at the history of mutual aid by asking us to consider this definition that Regan DeLogan's, an Indigenous activist with Indigenous Kinship Network, offers us. That mutual aid is essentially Indigenous life, ways, and sovereignty. It's Black thrivance and Black power. What that should tell us is that the principles and the values that undergird mutual aid are not new to us. They've existed in Indigenous communities, in African communities, in communities of color globally. And instead, right now, what we're seeing is an emergence of those same values coming to light. We move to the next slide. We can sort of think about mutual aid by other names. And so for here, thinking about Indigenous or sovereign nations, that these were ways that people lived in community with each other. It was not a matter of setting up a mutual aid network to get this going. This was how we functioned on a daily basis, how we build community, how we raised our families, and how we move through space. Maroon communities who, decided that, under slavery, colonization, that folks, can't live under these particular values and sought out new territories for themselves. These were also ways that Maroon communities created a whole life way pathway for themselves, sought out power, and to live in community with each other. So under colonization, imperialism, and other forms of systemic oppression, these lifeways became disrupted, but they still continued to thrive. If we think about the Combit system in Haiti, for example, Haitian anthropologist Joël Julien tells us that it's a traditional practice among Haitian farmers, where during harvesting and sowing seasons, farming communities came together to be able to take care of each other's lands and to exchange labor. And in return, the farmer whose land was being worked on would provide food for those there. Among African Americans, as early as the late 18th century, 1780s to be specific, there were free African societies and secret societies where folks came together to resource each other, to provide protection, provide community, provide identity. And this served as a foundation for social and economic structures of Black society during the time. Some would also argue and have argued that out of these mutual aid free societies emerged reform and protest organizations, which served as the basis for present movement efforts, if you will. Latinx communities also created mutualistas, where they pool their resources in order to offer members low-cost healthcare, insurance, funerals, low-cost loans, and other types of economic assistance. And as you go through any of these, if you're moving to the 1930s and so forth, and folks are talking about among workers, how volunteer societies and fraternal lodges and societies also came about as a way to resource folks during that period. So I just want us to know that these are things that are not new. What we're seeing is an emergence in this moment because of the exigencies and conditions under which people are being forced to live. And so I'll close with this Mexican proverb that is also attributed to other authors. And it said that they tried to bury us, but they didn't know that we were seeds. And so what we're witnessing now, and has been true at different points in history, are these seeds coming into sprouts, coming into trees, bearing fruits, and hopefully, will develop into big ass oaks that will help sustain us and help us transition into a better, just, more sustainable economy.
Great, thanks, Yolande. A lot of history there in very little time, so appreciate it. We're going to go to the specific cities, and Danielle, why don't you kick us off with Minneapolis, St. Paul?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome to Minneapolis. Welcome to my home on the north side of Minneapolis. And before I get going, just want to thank everyone that's decided to spend their time on this webinar with us today. And thank you for the work that you're doing in your own communities and for making some more time to look at a screen and dig into mutual aid work with us this afternoon. So the photo that you're looking at, many of you may have already seen, is a photograph of the George Floyd Square in South Minneapolis, which isn't really far from the north side of Minneapolis, but so that's where that image is. And so since the time that Mr. George Floyd was murdered, that intersection has been occupied by people that are grieving his death, grieving state violence of other deaths, and have continued to create art, make art, share, and come together at that intersection. We can go on to the next slide. So the mutual aid efforts in the Twin Cities, probably like most cities and towns across the country, really started to become and become more visible, I should say, with the emergence of COVID-19 earlier this year. So around that time, you started to see in the Twin Cities at a much larger scale, organizing happening on social media, sometimes outside social media, different Facebook groups, groups that were looking at, networking Twin Cities mutual aid in a response to COVID-19, there would be broken down into specific neighborhoods, geographies, sometimes broken down into identity groups, people coming together to share resources. Folks might share a short explanation of what they're seeking resources for and drop a Cash App, a Venmo. In those Facebook groups, people might need rides, things like that. And so those things were emerging since the beginning of COVID-19 and, you know, late March here in the Twin Cities. And then, as I referred to earlier, the end of May, Mr. George Floyd was murdered, and that murder was captured on video. And that video moved across the world and moved folks' hearts and minds. And Minneapolis became kind of the flashpoint for what became a global uprising against state violence. The photo that you see here is the uprising and the Minneapolis 3rd Precinct that was set on fire. I believe it was, it was a few days after Mr. Floyd was killed. And in light of those protests, there was a great need for mutual aid response, even increased need for mutual aid work because of the protesting and because of you know, the rebellion against state violence. There was you know, convenience stores broken into, grocery stores broken into, things were burnt down. A lot of folks had a hard time getting some of the supplies and food, medicine that they needed. And so folks, you know, almost immediately started to organize food drives. The community where I live already has kind of too few number of grocery stores. And so there were huge food drives across the Twin Cities, across North Minneapolis. And then also, you know, there was a need for mutual aid support as well, because the National Guard was called in eventually. There were curfews that were implemented across the city. And so not only was there a lack of ability to really get supplies that folks needed, but those folks that were still going to work, trying to get to work, just trying to move around the city, just trying to protest state violence, needed to really be networked for rides and for protection. Also, you know, there was, and some of these articles have come out more recently about some of the white supremacist violent attacks that were happening in the Twin Cities. There's been people that have been affiliated with the Boogaloo Boys and other white supremacist organizations that have now been charged with setting some of these fires, things like that. In the community where I live, it's majority Black, and we were seeing a lot of white supremacist violence presence in our own communities. And also, there was also a larger threat of police violence at this point in time too. And so there was also a mutual aid response just in terms of like protecting our own communities at that point in time too. So folks were figuring out how we were going to defend our own homes and neighborhoods, and also dealing with the tensions around how do we actually care for our neighbors and look out for our neighbors and not just start recreating the police in our neighborhoods. And so that was all emerging as these things were happening. And then also later in June, there was an emergence of call outs of sexual harassment and assault in our art, music, and nonprofits. And so there was also a mutual aid response to that in terms of resources, in terms of therapy resources, co-counseling, and things such as that. Unemployment has really risen due to COVID. And so we're seeing numbers as high as 50% of Black Minnesotans being underemployed and unemployed at this point in time. We've had also a great increase of housing encampments in our park systems across the Twin Cities.
So, can you go to the next slide? I'm sorry.
Yep.
Okay.
In terms of like the diverse mutual aid responses that we've seen, I mentioned already, there's been a lot of mutual aid response in terms of individuals to individuals. And so folks just seeing that someone needs support through social media, through our own kind of social networking, and being able to exchange money through Cash App or Venmo. People are sharing resources, space, and time. In terms of some of the nonprofits, how they have stepped up are things like providing stipends, redesignating program dollars, thinking creatively about how to share their own space. In terms of, I think it's really important, I wanted to uplift the fact that the folks that I've seen take on the most leadership of the mutual aid networks in my community have oftentimes been Black and Brown women and femmes. And there's too many of them for me to name individually that have really held down some of these networks, but that's what I have seen. Also, I wanted to just share that during the uprising, a couple of organizations in the Twin Cities, the Black Visions Collective, received almost $30 million of support from individual donors from across the world. And so the organization that I work with has been doing a rapid response fund. And so since September 1st through October 23rd, we have paid 820 people $739,000. And I can talk more later on, but that's part of the reason why I'm also on this call. I think I've gone over my time, so I'm going to pass it on.
All right, thanks, Danielle. Appreciate it. Mike, why don't you bring us to Chicago?
Okay, yes, thank you. So yeah, you can go ahead and drift to the next, just an introductory slide. Yeah, I just want to give a bit of context, one, in terms of the Kola Nut Collaborative's role within the Chicago context and history. The sort of broader mutual aid response in Chicago covers so much terrain, so much territory, so many neighborhoods. It would sort of be difficult to encapsulate. There is one unique light that I would shine, which is just, the sort of the rise of Brave Space Alliance, which is a Black trans-led organization, and which is really, really important, so I'll just kind of name that, and feel free to go to the Kola Nut Collaborative page, and you can kind of see an interview with Lasaya Wade on that. But for the context of the Kola Nut Collaborative, we grow out of, the Kola Nut Collaborative is a local time bank in Chicago. Time banking is just trading time as a currency. And we grew out of two we were midwifed by two organizations, rather, right? There's Healthy Food Hub on the top left there, and Calorie Collective on the top right. Calorie Collective was a time bank that was homed in St. Louis, and it had a different orientation to time banking than we had seen in the Chicago context. And Healthy Food Hub was connected to Black Oak Center, which was really grounded in building community resilience in Black communities that traditionally had not had educational opportunities on ecological resilience. So that's sort of the two organizations that kind of were the foundation of the Kola Nut Collaborative Time Bank. And there you kind of just see some imagery of things that were happening at the Healthy Food Hub when we were doing sort of our yarn exercises, as well as, me kind of doing some coaching in the Blueberry Patch in Rehoboth, but again, just this sort of fomenting of the ongoing work that is needed for community resilience, which the Kola Nut Collaborative sees as kind of the groundwork for longer term mutual aid, institutional mutual aid, which is where we'll go. So you can go to the next slide. What's Kola Nut Collaborative engaged in the present? So here you just see, you know, a sort of array of different imagery: New Economy Coalition, U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, Chicago Mutual Housing Network, the Movement Monday, Ujima Hour, the DSA Solidarity Economy Network, and Cooperation for Liberation Study and Working Group. The Kola Nut Collaborative, in the context of this sort of larger mutual aid response, really sees itself as what does movement infrastructure look like? What does it look like to be able to build and sustain connections between different initiatives, between different projects, ensure that there are routes where information, resources, and things are flowing, and then, you know, where there are opportunities to kind of build deeper relationships and deeper connections between different initiatives. How can you do that? So, you know, right now, we see the sort of Chicago Mutual Housing Network, you know, which is something that's developing, which is, you know, connecting the cooperative housing space to some of the other cooperative spaces in the city. And it's traditionally been a connection that's been broken, you know, just that sort of larger sphere of cooperation. So that's how Kola Nut Collaborative situates itself, both in this current mutual aid moment, but also in the sort of longer trajectory of what mutual aid might look like as we move from this place where it's emergency to where it's institutional, and where we are actually needing to kind of build permanent infrastructure for that moment beyond, which was sort of spoken about on that November, or will be touched upon in that November 12th webinar. And you can go to the next slide there. And then just kind of giving a preview of the Kola Nut future, right? You know, if for those who are not familiar, you know, with the sort of the symbolism of the Kola Nut in Igbo culture, this is West African culture. The Kola Nut is exchanged as a symbol of hospitality, as a symbol of, you know, a desire to connect and build beneficial trading relationships, a symbol of welcome into a household. You know, you go in and you split the Kola Nut and you each eat a piece and you drink your water, right? So it's about having a currency that has both sort of symbolic or cultural meaning, but also sort of has, you know, social other types of value. And ultimately, you know, the Kola Nut Collaborative really sees itself as a platform for deeper connections, for deeper relationships. On the right, you know, that sort of image is what you might call a social infrastructure. And Nicholas Christakis' work speaks to the fact that, you know, social determinants of health and all sorts of other things travel along these social infrastructures. And so the Kola Nut Collaborative is seeking to kind of reinforce and engage these social infrastructures for long-term mutual good. And I'll stop there.
Okay, Mike, thanks so much. And before I go to Yolande, who's up next to talk about Atlanta, just a brief pitch. If you have questions for Danielle or Mike, please put them in the question box and we will get to those. And Yolande, bring us to Atlanta.
Thanks, Steve. Next slide, please. So thinking about Atlanta, one of the things, Atlanta goes by many names as a way to sort of talk about what its history and reputation is. It's the Black Mecca, you know, it's north of the South and south of the North. But one of the things about Atlanta is also the #1 city in the nation for income inequality. That means a gap between those who have and those who do not, is the largest anywhere in this nation. So prior to COVID-19, you know, folks were fighting what is typically called food deserts, but are food apartheid. And folks have been building cooperatives. Folks have been organizing to, you know, free people from cages and resourcing ourselves in ways that known to me and unknown to me. And so I want to ask you all to hold in your minds when we think about whether it's Minneapolis, Chicago, or Atlanta, that mutual aid has been going on before this moment. And what we're seeing are different things bubbling to the surface. My home organization listed here, Organization for Human Rights and Democracy, has been long engaged in building alternative models for the future, cooperative organizing, mutual aid funds, and so forth. Not mutual aid, but loan funds, cooperative loan funds. So the mutual aid there had looked like the cooperative organizing and development that's been taking place by OHRD, Pecan Milk Cooperative, the green one in the corner, and the Come Up Project that you see youth selling products that they've created as a part of a co-op for formerly incarcerated youth. It's also looked like honoring food as a human right and making sure that folks are fed through the Atlanta Free Store and Food Not Bombs. It was people pooling their time and skills to the Metro Atlanta Time Bank, and freeing Black mamas from cages through the Black Mamas Bailout, anchored by Southerners on New Ground or Song. And then there was the Mutual Aid and Liberation Center that was co-anchored between a partnership between Georgia Citizens Coalition on Hunger and Project South, as well as the work of the Guild around building intentional communities, workspaces, co-housing, and moving towards collective community ownership of land and real estate. So the Metro Atlanta Mutual Aid Fund, we came together at the mid-March when the state basically shut down and the rest of the country was shutting down. And it's OHRD, the Guild, the Come Up Project, the Atlanta Time Bank, and other individuals who are invested in making sure that our people are being resourced. Veteran organizer Tamika Middleton created a Facebook group for her network, having come out of Katrina and knowing what that moment was like. And from there, 20 folks came together to organize the Mutual Aid Fund. We eventually landed on 13 people who remained. We quickly put our skills in organizing and so forth together to build the Mama Fund. And so the values that holds that together are that we focus on BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, and other peoples of color, peoples being intentional here, with special attention paid to folks we know are especially vulnerable within these categories around gender, sexuality, class, immigration status, and so forth. We emphasize a radical trust in our people, which means we're not going to ask people to degrade themselves by giving us all the horrors of what they're suffering. But the fact that folks have suffered for centuries, we know that whatever we're giving them through this fund is insufficient to actually meet what they've gone through. We prioritize communities over donors. So we're asking donors, don't ask us for extensive report in this moment. Don't tell us how we should spend the money. We are listening to folks and we're listening to us, being able to hear as members of communities themselves what people need. And we're also utilizing a wealth redistribution framework. We encourage employers, for example, corporations want to give to us. We've turned folks away, saying the donation you're giving is not proportionate to what you've been doing in community. In fact, we want you to prioritize funding the people who do work in your organizations that are being furloughed or laid off and not given sick leave and so forth. And that we want to ensure that funds reach communities outside of the city by emphasizing counties that are not typically reached when things happen or come into Atlanta. So the impact that we've had so far is that we've given out funds to over 800 families. And based on what's come in through applications, that's over 4,000 individuals. We've raised over $500,000 and we've given out nearly all of it so far. We're probably close to the 527 at this moment. The 450 was back in September. And we've organized in that moment to be able to service folks in the array of languages that you see here by calling on community to do that work. The final slide, please. And so the tagline of Mama Fund is that rapid response now, but our ultimate vision is alternative systems for our future, grown out of the work that organizers who've come together have been doing. And for us, that vision looks like creating an interdependent ecosystem of individual families and communities in an abundant, loving, and joyful Metro Atlanta region. Ecosystems where our communities, structures, institutions are life-affirming and are aligned with Mother Earth, and communities where we're all valued and supported and nourished. For us, that looks practically like building a time banking system to connect the thousands of folks who've come through Mama Fund. It looks like building a robust network of folks who are committed to building these alternative visions of the future. And it also looks like having a concerted effort to make sure that folks who do have the resources are committed to giving back and giving forward in an ethical, just, and dignified way through our process of initiating around decolonizing wealth and wealth redistribution.
Great, thanks, Yolande. So we'll take down the slides and ask a couple of questions of folks, and then please, all of you who are participants, I see a couple of questions on the list, and keep them coming. So thanks so much. So Danielle, I wanted to start with you, and I mean, so Nexus Community Partners, where you work, is an intermediary that sort of ended up becoming responsible for distributing some of the money in the mutual aid network. So how do you manage that process, and what infrastructure was in place and what had to be created?
Yeah. So first, when COVID first started earlier this year, we immediately started looking at what resources we could shift around to, in particular, some of the networks of folks that we'd already been working with in our cooperative fellowship circles, and we have some leadership development. We have a leadership development program, and decided that we would offer stipends of up to $500 for the fellows that we had relationships with so far. And I just share that because I think it's important for organizations to reconsider how they are using their funds during this moment in time, and that there's ways that we can be creative within our organizations to do that. So currently, that I kind of rapidly walked through at the end of my slides, Nexus has been working with Black Visions Collective to help them redistribute $3.1 million in a rapid response fund. And I think that we thought we knew a lot more about how we would do this and how it might work before we even got started. So we have been creating and building a lot of systems as we go. I think there's some constraints with a nonprofit organization trying to get money out the door to individuals. Currently, right now, we have an application system. We have received over 1,700 applications for individual mutual aid. The individual mutual aid goes out, it's centered on Black folks and Indigenous folks in the Twin Cities. And you can request up to $1,000. We're making those payments through PayPal, through direct deposits, and through checks. There could be a lot more support in terms of moving cash to individuals through some of these electronic payment systems. It's been difficult through PayPal. We've been flagged for things. And so at certain points in time, we would only be able to put $5,000 a day into our PayPal account. And we're really working to try and get money out the door as quickly as possible. So that's a little bit about how we get some of the funds out the door. We're really trying to work with folks that have different documentation status to make sure that there aren't strings attached to a lot of that work. And I guess it's important to say that I think that there's a lot of support that maybe some foundations could give in terms of the foundations that are able to give stipends to folks without requiring a W-9. I think that would be a really important tool to be able to use. But I think also before foundations really step into the world of individual mutual aid work, which they haven't really done in our community, is that they really need to grapple with this idea of what does mutuality mean to them and how are they accountable to communities, and before they really get into that work. So that's a little bit about how we've been dispersing money. Great, thanks, Danielle. Mike, I wanted to bring you into the conversation here, and there's actually, what are some of the question that we had was, what are some of the strengths and weaknesses nonprofits bring to the work and community groups? There definitely are questions from the audience too that relate to this in terms of, how do you research this work? How do you avoid the traps of the nonprofit industrial complex? So take this however you want to go with it. But obviously this is different than sort of the normal nonprofit's modus operandi. So, delve into a little bit of that.
Yeah, so, building infrastructure and maintaining infrastructure is a practice. And it's a practice that not everyone wants to engage in. So, you know, when I thought about the development of the Kola Nut Collaborative Time Bank, I was completely disinterested in running a nonprofit. And at this point, you know, the Kola Nut Collaborative is a fiscally sponsored endeavor, and it will probably persist in such state until such time as another community, decides that, it should be something else. So, I mean, not all but a nonprofit is a legal entity and a legal infrastructure. There are specific guidelines and constraints, of course, that exist around that legal entity and infrastructure. So if a nonprofit wants to engage, it kind of has to do the same thing that organizers would do anyway, which is build relationships, be in conversation, lead by asking, and then say, how can we adapt this infrastructure to serve the needs of this moment, of this time? And I like the words, that Renee Hatcher of John Marshall has often said about the law. She was like, look, the law is not stopping anyone from building cooperatives in Chicago. It's just a thing that's there. How can we build around the law if it's in the way? So ultimately, how can we use this infrastructure to meet the needs of this moment? And so, yeah, in terms of strengths and weaknesses, the strength, again, it is an infrastructure that is already built, that has a process in place, that has some procedure, that can help with documentation, which a lot of grassroots folks, including myself, I'm a grassroots folk, don't want to deal with, right? But it also has some impediments in terms of what the ways that it has learned to function that need to actually be addressed, right? If you're trying to kind of connect it to this.
Understand that.
Shut up, Google. Yeah, Google does not understand it, right? Yeah, so you cannot Google this, right? You actually do have to build a new process on the fly, as Danielle has noted, right? You have to kind of figure out where are the limitations in your infrastructure and how can you work around those limitations.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for bringing the special effects in. That was great. Yolande, what are other you work with a lot of nonprofits, I know that, and but what are other nonprofits and philanthropies' responsibility in supporting mutual aid, and how can the resources flow?
Yeah, I'm going to build off of Mike's point, which is that nonprofits are a legal entity that does have infrastructure to be able to support this work, and that's what OHRD provides in terms of Mama Fund, because we serve as a fiscal conduit for that. But we're also clear that we're committed to building democratic processes as part of the way that we move our nonprofit work. And so it was very easy once we got together as part of that to say, actually, here are processes that we have been able to incubate and develop and model over here that can be useful here. On the philanthropy side, in terms of responsibility, I'll start by saying that in Atlanta during the COVID crisis, $25 million were brought together by the Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta and the United Way. And according to the Center for Civic Innovation that ran a study on it after several months, 50% of that money went to male and white-led and founded organization, while only 10% of that money went to Black women-led organizations. None of it came to Mama Fund, none of it came to OHRD, and none of it came to the partners that we're in conversation with who are on the ground in communities doing this work. So the role that any nonprofit and philanthropy can play is trust BIPOC people, trust Black women, trust Indigenous peoples, trust trans, non-binary, queer folk, that we as the folk who are directly and multiply impacted, we not only have the solutions, but we have the resources and the skill sets to be able to move this in its most just and useful ways. Until August of this year, which is 4 months into the pandemic, the largest donation we got was $15,000 from a donor advised fund. And what we kept getting asked were requests to how is this not charity? How is this not these things? You're also clogging up our time when we could be resourcing folks, when we've also shared a number of resources about what this is. So at the end of the day, I feel like much of the money in philanthropy is stolen wealth. So give it back to the communities and the people from whom it came.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to go to some audience questions, and there's some really good ones. So this one comes from a Chicana living in a mostly white neighborhood and with a pro-cop neighborhood, and she's asking, how can I engage in mutual aid if I don't even feel safe in my own neighborhood, don't feel connected to my neighbors? It occurs to me like there's this history of mutual aid and there's sort of this broken chain, right? We're rebuilding structures that used to exist in some ways, right? So yeah, I'm interested in anybody's thoughts on how do you rebuild the community necessary to sustain mutual aid?
I could start us off. Thank you for your question. And the preface, sounds right, which is that recognizing that the disruptions that have existed because of the oppressive systems under which we're being forced to create life. And that's real. My neighborhood, I've been here for a year. I've made an effort to get to know my neighbors and to build with them. But I'm also aware that I have access to a range of other folk that are in my community, in my network, and to start building there as we organize to be able to build the folks who are closest to us. That is part of the strategy for Mama Fund, which is that if we're working across 8 counties, that's a boatload of people who are not in conversation with each other. And so as organizers, we have a responsibility for helping to rebuild those circuits of communication and community. But start with the community that you do have and build a mutual aid network from there and continue to deepen in your local environment.
Great. Danielle, you want to add anything to, you've worked with community wealth, no? Okay.
No, I think that sometimes we have to I agree with everything Yolande said, and that we can start really small, and sometimes it might just mean that it's just 2 or 3 of us doing this work to start off, and that's perfectly fine. Some of the hardest work probably the hardest work in organizing is relationships. And so, but you have to start and you have to just continue to build slowly. So I just hope that they'll take faith in that and find a couple of folks to start building with.
Great, thanks. Another question from the audience was about governance structure for mutual aid networks. So, nonprofits have a governance structure, not necessarily sometimes democratic, sometimes less than democratic, but there's a board, you can find it. What does mutual aid governance look like, and how do you maintain that accountability to community? Anyone want to jump on that?
I spend a lot of time thinking about it, and that means that basically it's an evolving process, and it's not something that I necessarily found an answer to. I am in a governance challenge right now with a collective, trying to kind of determine, how we have conversations around money, how we have conversations around, accountability and projects that we take on, right? And so what I think, well, one, all governance structure starts with a conversation. How do we want to feel on the other side of these decisions? How do we want to engage with each other? And so it's not necessarily meaning that you're going to take any one governance structure out of the box and apply it to your situation. You might go and find consensus, and you might go and find sociocracy, and you might find some elements that will work for the process of whatever collective or organization you're working to govern. But some adaptations will have to be made. So, the question was specifically about governance structure of organization. So I don't know if that addresses their question, if they're really talking about nonprofits or if they're talking about these mutual aid collectives. But I would say that a lot of the collectives of which I've engaged have had to adapt governance over time by kind of examining some of those real feeling states, like how does it feel at the sort of heart and feeling level, right? So.
Mm-hmm. Is there a way in which people who are receiving aid, then become co-participants and governors of the project and the fund? Is there sort of that level of reciprocity? How does that work?
Just building on Mike's great response. That's the same thing that we're working through here. When we started with the collective of 13 folks, we quickly moved into a democratic process. Where we have a consensus decision-making model to work us through, having 3 turns at it to be able to amend, and at the end of it, leaning really hard into trust, right, and being very clear and transparent. And quickly after that, developing a conflict transformation process, recognizing that things will come up, and the sooner we can create something to help support that, the better. And then we had decisions that could pass through our consensus process, but recognizing that folks were just not okay with the result. And having meetings go multiple hours to be able to actually work through what is it that is at the core of what is trying to be communicated, so that we can not just feel good about it, but know that we worked with good intention. Folks don't splinter off into factions who might have disagreed with the decision that got pushed through. And the other piece is, yes, for us, it is critical. If we're talking about trusting community and building with community, community has to also be at the center of it. But we also recognize that for it to be effective, we need to have shared values and shared goals about where we're going. And so that's also a process of organizing and moving folk into that decision-making process more fully. And so as we build out the network, thinking through what does it look like to bring folks into it more fully as decision makers that are on par with anybody else in the system.
Great, thanks. That's really helpful. Couple other really good questions. One is, there's a, how, I'll just read the question. My experience is that, some of the mutual aid responses, actually end up replicating nonprofit hierarchy structures, and how might mutual aid actually become, I know this is stuff that these are things that you guys are aiming to do, to become centers of organizing and imagining new systems, balancing immediate and long-term vision.
I think for us, we've been very clear that we are aware of the structure of the nonprofit system, and that it becomes a tool, a particular tactic for bringing resources in that don't get taxed or that don't do these things, but we're being in line with what the sort of legal requirements are, and folk are connected to their own cultural histories and are bringing that into the conversation, being clear to listen to community about what works for them, what fosters trust. When we're dealing with folks who are undocumented, folks who have been through the welfare system, who have developed really useful for them survival tactics to be able to get the resources they need, and having the empathy to understand what is happening there, to not replicate the same dynamics that will continue to compound the violence that they've been experiencing. So I feel like the most critical part of that, to not replicate these really violent and troubling systems that we have been utilizing to move through social movements, is to be most connected to the people. How do we preserve people's dignity? How do we build trust? How do we reshape our relationships to each other? And remaining flexible. The question around nonprofits and sort of how that, the most sort of unhelpful thing about is that they're really inflexible and rigid because of the financial structures and the legal structures around it. And so not falling into that pattern and being really creative and open to really leaning into trust. I can't emphasize that heavily enough.
Great, thanks. I think this question is somewhat related. So this is from a small grassroots funder. And they're saying, how as a funder, how do I distinguish between, doing rapid response funds from, the charity model and actually supporting mutual aid? How can I tell the difference? And the organizations that actually are promoting solidarity and reciprocity and not just a charity model.
Who makes what decisions? Who makes the decisions? Who holds power? How does that process flow? And I mean, there's an interesting dynamic here, right? Because you are a funder coming to a project, and so in that space, you're in a seat of power in a sense, right? Have sort of financial power in that conversation. So it's hard to kind of issue a challenge in this moment, because also we're trying to disrupt a lot of different power dynamics in this very moment. But I mean, that is a question that should be posed if someone yeah, that is a question that should be posed. I don't know who should pose it. That's sort of a larger question again about these inverse power dynamics. But where does power lie? Where does decision making lie? A lot of that will determine sort of where you can see solidarity versus charity.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with what Mike said, and I think funders that can locate where they're accountable and how they're able to be held accountable within the communities that they're working with, will do better at this. And I think a lot of the funders that I've seen that have over time been able to practice accountability, because really there is no accountability for funders. There's no reason, like at the end of the day, there's just not really a lot of incentive. So for those that have been able to cultivate some level of accountability with communities, a lot of them practice not leaving when things get really hard. And when communities question how they do things, and when they're able to accept that they've done things that have been harmful and disruptive, and continue to show up at tables and continue to keep promises and not shy away from conflict and tension in community. And then another thing that I think funders can do is to show that their accountability is to also challenge their funder partners to continue to try and practice some of the work that they're doing that's working well. And I know that can be a difficult, I think that's probably one of the best places for them to also show some accountability. And again, like what Yolande has said about trusting people, that's a really big value and muscle that all of us need to really practice every day.
If
Great.
I could, Steve,
yeah,
just
please.
a word on that, which is the question of charity versus mutual aid has come up a few times for us. Start by giving the money to the people who are directly impacted. At the core of it, these are folks who care about the people that they're working with. And they're going to be there for the long haul with and without the money. In a rapid response moment, sometimes it is hard to know that. But in a rapid response moment, the way to guarantee it, give the money to the people who are directly impacted. They're going to be there whether you give them the money or not, and that's mutual aid, because they're trying to resource their communities in a moment of crisis, and they're going to be there thereafter.
Great, thanks. So I'll ask one last question, and it's really trying to connect, how do you connect the mutual aid and the immediate response? And let's not kid ourselves there. There's complete withdrawal of federal support right now. We know that regardless of what happens to the election, there's not going to be new money for at least until the end of January, most likely. And you're trying to build a more just and sustainable economy for the long haul, and actually build towards systems change. And I know some of you have been involved with cooperatives and other forms of development. So how do you sort of both address the immediate needs, which are massive, and keep that eye on that systemic change?
I think a lot of the work that I do in working with folks to help them get their cooperatives launched, a big thing is trust, is relationships. I think part of the promise of mutual aid work in the Twin Cities is folks building smaller circles of people that they trust and want to build community with to build this mutuality and these more caring networks that will eventually lend themselves to developing the relationships that can build a more solidarity economy and more sustainability. And I think that it's going to take everyone. And so the way that we work and how we work needs to be open and gracious to people, and invite people to figure out what their role is in doing some of this work. And so I'm not trying to make it sound rosy. I think what we have ahead of us in the next couple of months is going to be pretty difficult, but I really do think that having smaller groups of folks looking out for one another will help us all, more of us, get through this better, and also lends itself to the type of economy that I hope to continue to create with others.
Great. Mike, anything you want to throw in?
Yeah, the Kola Nut Collaborative is formed out of this work with the Healthy Food Hub, which was just looking at the systemic challenges and inequities in the food system and food logistics. That work continues within Black Oak Center to think about those challenges in the production, aggregation, and distribution of food. And so, the work of the Kola Nut Collaborative now has evolved to kind of looking at those inefficiencies elsewhere. You know, that cooperative housing network in Chicago is fragmented. So how can we build better communication and infrastructure channels there? So, you know, I think that this current moment of mutual aid, you know, giving people sort of a lens towards what a solidarity economy means, what a more equitable economy means, why we need a people strike now, hashtag people strike, and, you know, but all of those sorts of things are helping us to realize what the resistance fights, what the resistance movements have been telling us, you know, for decades, you know, I mean, so if we can root ourselves in the fact that the resistance has been telling us this, and that this is a moment where we can make those changes and address those challenges, then I think that, you know, we can get to building the infrastructure of the future. Check.
Great. Yolande, you have one last 30 seconds, and then we have to wrap up.
Echoing all that Danielle and Mike have said, and to say that the work that OHRD and others have been doing to build a feminist solidarity economy in Metro Atlanta, and to model it and, you know, proliferate it wherever folk are open to it, will continue. We see the mutual aid for us is, I'll end where I started, which is that if these are life ways to build power and to sort of reconnect our communities, and it moves us beyond these transactional, commoditized relationships that we're now in, whether those are to people or places or resources. And it moves us towards building that future that we want to see. But I think we have to get each other now so that we can be there for the long haul.
Great. Well, let me close and thank Mike Strode, Danielle Mkali, Yolande Tomlinson. There's a slide. Can somebody put that up, please? Yeah, so I want to give everyone who's on this call a chance. This will also be in the materials, so you don't have to write everything down now, but that's everyone's contact information. Thanks again so much to the panelists and to all of you who participated in this call for your excellent questions. So this is a topic that we'll be following at Nonprofit Quarterly, and you know, we welcome a continuation of the conversation. So, so please complete the evaluation after the call. Thanks for your support of MPQ, and thanks for being here. Thanks, everyone.